We're now going to be talking about the shifting IP landscape in Asia, Europe and the United States. Unfortunately, just nothing's going on at the moment, so I don't know how we're going to film for 45 minutes. It's going to be hard, but we're going to try. So let me introduce my panel. First of all, to my immediate left, we've got Mark Cohen from UC Berkeley. Next to Mark is Jamie Simpson from the Coalition for IP. And on my far left is Daniel Marti from Tencent. We do actually have a lot to talk about, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing everyone, but their bios are all available in the conference notes. So, the shifting IP system in the US, Asia and Europe. And underneath that is kind of an intro. Europe and China have been strengthening their innovation and IP systems as the US, once the gold standard for IP rights, continues to decline. Now I'm going to actually test that assumption before we go anywhere else. And I want to ask a question of each of the panelists is the fact that an innovation system is strong really linked to the strength of the IP system? I agree that there's been some decline in the patent system in the US. It's certainly been a major improvement in China. But coming from Europe, I come from a continent where we probably have some of the strongest IP enforcement in the world. But look at all the problems that Europe has in terms of innovation. So is IP actually linked to innovation in the way that we assume from the question in the conference later? And I'll start with Mark and just go down the line.
Sure. Well, thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here. I think the answer to that is that, first of all, certain forms of technology are more IP dependent than others. Some of them depend on other factors, including scalability, different types of IP, rapid market development, the type we just heard about with Flipstick, and other areas. Also, being right here in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, we have a perfect example of that. This is not a region that's representative of the United States in terms of patent density, invention per capita, startups, and many other indicators we want to see that are associated with that. And if you went to places like Detroit or Rochester, New York, which at one time was the center of American innovation, you found that it wasn't the patent system that fell behind, it was other factors in the ecosystem. So it's one part of the system, and it's technology dependent.
I think I would agree with that. I think, it's interesting in trying to look at this across the different jurisdictions we're talking about too. There's a certain time element to it as well. So I think the U.S. has historically had a strong patent system, maybe stronger than it is now. And it's been weakened over maybe the past 20 years. I think there are aspects of the European patent system that have arguably only become strong recently. Likewise, the Chinese have made significant changes to their patent system more within the span of the last 20 or so years. So, we're kind of at an interesting phase where the U.S., I think in some ways is still coasting off some of its earlier strengths. We're really starting to see cracks. But the real concern is, are we currently investing in the sort of long-term R&D that is going to benefit us 20, 30 years from now? And that's where things like the patent system, I think, really come into play. So you might not be fully seeing the effects, but I think we're seeing the warning signs in our laws.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Bruce, and our Dolby hosts. It's always great to be in this building, and it was a lot of fun in the cinema. Thank you. I'll answer the question maybe in two different ways. I think, our panel and many people here, we've been practicing in the IP space now for several decades. I've been for about 25, 26 years. So I would caution against kind of painting a kind of rise and fall narrative when it comes to kind of IP regimes. The U.S. is still a global leader when it comes to having IP at the center of our policy debates. There are some exceptions, of course, many of them recently, but it's still a global leader. What I think is happening is that a lot of other countries have been catching up. As Jamie mentioned, what has been happening in China over the last 20 years, you can see that, around the world. Patents and copyright, right, are embedded into the Constitution, right, 1788, 1789 in force. The Lanham Act, I think, was back in the 40s. So the US had focused on IP early, while a number of other countries, and even like Bayh-Dole is what, like 80, early 80s, 45 years ago, right? So the US started sprinting, putting IP in the middle, and I think a lot of other countries have kind of realized that. And Tencent, in China, Tencent has invested billions and billions of dollars over the last just 10 years and have filed thousands of lawsuits to protect its own business models, its music, streaming, TV and film, broadcast, video games, et cetera, and flipping the script from a market that was predominantly piracy driven to now about 97, 98% license driven. So I think you see the rest of the world kind of catching up. So the second part of your question about, is it just, IP that does it? No, IP is a critical component. It helps solidify fair business practices. You can't just steal from somebody else, right? It tries to tamp down sharp business practices, but you need to have everything else to really make it work, to have innovation in your marketplaces, from access to capital and so on.
Yeah, I think for me that's a really important point, that we hear a lot, for example, about Chinese IP theft and that China has got to where it is on the back of stealing American innovation or what have you. But if we focus on that too much, don't we lose sight of the fact that Chinese companies have invested billions and billions of dollars in R&D, that the government did put in place long-term strategies to actually promote certain types of innovation and certain areas of technology. And all of those things must have been at least equally important as the fact that, like all other countries that have gone from developing to developed over the last 2 centuries, China did steal a lot of intellectual property too. I mean, in the 19th century, Charles Dickens was wandering around the United States moaning about the fact that all his copyrights had been stolen. The Japanese and the Koreans did it after World War II, but maybe the difference between China and everyone else is that China is the first country to have moved from developing to developed in the digital era. That it's not something inherently evil about China, it's something about the age in which we're living. I just wonder what the panelists think about that.
If I can, and this is a topic that we could have a whole day of you listening to me talk. I'm not going to do that, but let me just first say that IP is not about theft. And we use that term, but most of IP is enforced civilly, and we all know there's no criminal patent remedy per se, and most of what happens that is nefarious is not captured by the criminal regime. Point one. Point two, and the reason I really would prefer that concept gets thrown out, is the number of criminal IP cases in China is about 10,000 per year. How many are there in the US? I don't know whether Danny remembers, but the number is probably less than 100. So if you're talking about criminality in IP, China actually does a lot to address criminality. And the civil docket is about 530,000 cases per year. What are we at in the US? About 20,000? So these numbers don't correspond to an IP theft criminality type situation. They may have other issues. They do have other issues associated with it. China's IP filings, patent filings, are disproportionate to its economic growth. And that's the other really important point here. This is a statist approach to intellectual property and needs to be recognized as such. We just had a WTO dispute, which the EU won in part with respect to transparency. If you do not have full transparency, you cannot say, I cannot say, and I spent my life doing this, what China's IP system is like today, because 2/3 of the civil cases alone are not published. So this is a really difficult thing to get a grasp around. And I would say, yes, China has been innovating. Yes, there's a lot of diamonds in the coal of what is often a very rough system to assess, and there's a lot of self-inflicted injury. To me, the really two interesting places in the horizon. One is China as a SEP licensor, where we see more and more activity by Huawei and others, and that's been going on for some time. And the second one, which I think is even more interesting, is China has now become a biotech licensor. Billions of dollars of foreign pharma companies are now paying to take on Chinese compounds. So there certainly is real innovation taking place.
The point that I am concerned about when you talk about theft in China and IP is that I think it does kind of detract from the point that we have to really focus on making our own system here at home strong. And there are certainly more components than just an IP system that go into it. And I think if you're only talking about theft, and there may be abusive practices, there's certainly plenty of anecdotes and some evidence of that from China. You're kind of taking away from what we actually need to do to be competitive on our own. And I think you also run into the place where you're going to be blind to real advancements going on. And it's going to be all too tempting at that point to say, well, we really need to weaken our IP system so we can just take their technology instead of inventing it here ourselves. And if you think a strong IP system is important for incentivizing innovation, that's the exact wrong dynamics to start getting involved in. And so I worry that we go too far down that path instead of figuring out what we can do to strengthen ourselves here.
So, Danny, from the perspective of China, from the Chinese company's perspective, when you hear the discussions around IP theft and the fact this is what China's all about, how is that received in China, and does it actually make any difference to the way in which companies there approach IP and the process of innovation more generally?
I mean, I think Mark said it well. I don't know how much to add. Tencent is just a different animal than I think the general Chinese company, right? Tencent's core business models rely heavily on international partners and licenses. So it's perhaps not a fair comparison across the entire Chinese market. But the Chinese market looks different today than it did 20 years ago, without question. Some of the public debate is kind of tired generalizations. Some of it is fair. There are continued need for improvement there, as well as in many markets around the world. And then some of it, I think, is, I forget if Mark said, kind of self-inflicted wounds. I mean, there's some things that I have seen practicing IP for a few decades too that, sometimes head scratching. So, I was speaking to the head of IP for one of the leading French brands that you would all know very well, and, was talking to me about, how many issues the company has in China. And I asked him, like, well, talk to me about your enforcement team mechanism strategy, walk me through it. And this global mega brand has one person in China. And you almost have to take a step back and say, and Mark, you probably saw that a lot, when you were at the embassy.
Absolutely.
It's like you have one person and then you complain that you don't have it right. Well, when you look at the market, when you look at the revenue, there's also sometimes a wrong allocation of resources. I think the strategy has not been sufficiently vetted. Sometimes it's hiring the wrong lawyers that aren't experienced with Chinese courts, et cetera.
Yeah, just statistically, out of those 530,000 cases that were filed last year, somewhere between 1 and 1.5% involve foreign. So you're looking at a lot of complaints with not necessarily the boots on the ground to support them. And I can remember one time in the embassy, we had about 10 people sitting around talking about a trademark issue of a U.S. company. And I said, why don't we just get into our budgets, each give this company $500 and tell them to file the goddamn trademark? Because it was costing us well more than the cost of the trademark to sit around and listen to their complaint. Of course, we didn't have the authority to do that, but that is kind of sometimes the inanity of the issues. And there are certainly lots of legitimate issues as well. But
that's a really important point, though, isn't it? I mean, IP can't be stolen if IP doesn't exist in the first place. So if you don't have a trademark filed in China, no one can be stealing that trademark because it doesn't exist in the first place. And it does seem to me there has been a level of engagement problem, certainly until quite recently in China, that there was a lot of complaining, but actually not much doing. Maybe it's just easier to complain than it is to spend the money. I'm going to ask a lot of difficult questions here that I might not necessarily agree with, but I just feel that they've got to be asked. I'm going to raise points in the same way. So let's move to the US. I was at an event in London a few weeks ago, and there was a session about what the Trump administration will mean for IP. And I thought it'd be a session that looked at the legislation that's in front of Congress, who the new USPTO director was going to be and what have you. And it was a panel of very senior corporate IP leaders from European and Asian companies. I was genuinely shocked when one of the opening questions was, can you have an IP system where the rule of law doesn't exist? Can we trust the United States to treat our IP in the way that IP will be treated, that American IP will be treated in the courts and at the USPTO? Does America first mean that it's Americans first now, and the IP system is going to be a part of that? What do the tariffs mean in terms of our priorities for patents? What does it mean to the value of US patents? And to hear senior IP people talking like that in public at an event, you might have that conversation at the drinks reception or what have you, but actually hear it on the record and reportable was something I found genuinely shocking. And I just would like to sort of, let's have a conversation about where things are with the US in terms of the IP system. I get a lot of sense, there's a lot of exultation that John Squires is going to be the new USPTO director, that Howard Lutnick is a man that has filed a lot of patents. And that's great on one level, but then if the USPTO can't retain its examiners, if the tariffs mean that people aren't going to be investing in IP in the same way, does any of that matter? So again, I'll just go down the line and we can maybe bounce some ideas off each other. So let's start with Mark.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's one that's been troubling me increasingly, particularly since Trump was elected, although it had come up earlier. We saw it to a degree in the Trump 1.0 with the trade war and tariffs being imposed on China as a result of IP theft and the like. But now we have, I don't know how many, 150, potentially 180, potentially different tariff rates. So MFN treatment, most national treatment, are basically out the window in terms of tariffs. Everybody is going to be judged on a reciprocal basis, which is really going to be a headache for USTR. They probably need to expand their head count by 200 times. There's 17,000 lines of tariffs, 2,200 pages in the harmonized tariff schedule, multiplied by 185 countries. You get the idea that this is actually potentially a huge task. But the question really is, in our space, how much does that reversal of 150 years in IP since Berne and Paris conventions mean that now we're talking about IP on a reciprocal basis? And I think the good news here is I don't think China is about to change its IP system simply because of the tariffs. But they have already done things like limit Hollywood movies, launched antitrust investigations, and other countries, including the EU, have talked about digital services and the like, perhaps affecting streaming and other services. And it would not be surprising if one of these affected countries said, gee, I'm hardly importing anything from the US. The only thing I can really do that will sting them is to seize their patents or trademarks or proprietary technology. So I think we're at a moment, we're at a higher level of systemic risk to the global IP system, and particularly to the US IP system, because of the way we've departed from what has been the international norm for many, many years regarding treatment of our trading partners, and particularly in IP. And I think that kind of balkanized IP system would be very bad as Andre mentioned, I spoke to him afterwards as well, we are a leading exporter of technology. I think people had come to the U.S. on the expectation that we'd be transparent and fair. And if those things are under attack, then there's unfortunate consequences that follow.
Absolutely. Just to add one point to that, it's not just the fact that the US is a net exporter of IP, and as Andre said this morning, it has a huge surplus in that area. The more expensive US products become overseas, or the less available they become, the more you incentivize counterfeiting and piracy, don't you? You actually incentivize the stealing of IP theft. So there's all these things floating around, Jamie. How do you see it as someone that's sort of based in Washington, D.C. and is seeing the policies play out?
Well, there is definitely a lot going on right now. I guess, I think kind of starting from where you both left off, I feel like a lot of the conversation needs to focus on the fact that this is where the U.S. has a competitive advantage right now. And it's based on an international system that we played a leading role in creating. And, along with that, I think it embedded our values. And I think, just leaving aside just kind of the pure monetary economics of it, it's also a system that I think has been mentioned earlier, has fostered international collaboration and allowed a sort of scientific achievement and advancement that we wouldn't have necessarily been able to achieve, certainly not as quickly, if we had all been siloed off into different countries. So I say that by way of saying that if we kind of go in a more fragmented direction, we really risk losing a lot, and that concerns me a lot. But I think right now for everyone who's in the field, this is a time to really make the case for why our system is important, why overall it's working, even if parts of it need to be fixed. Certainly my organization has a list of things we'd like to see changed and improved, but I think that doesn't change the ultimate fact that even just going back to the beginning of this country, having a unique, at that time, patent system in the world really spurred our advancement, and we shouldn't risk losing that. It's really easy to lose something. It's really hard to build it up again.
I've been somewhat negative or depressed the last 3 months, so it kind of surprises me that I'll be the optimist here on this panel. I don't see the IP regime under attack in the U.S. I don't see these big swings happening from administration to administration. Yes, there are some debates that pick up renewed interest and then kind of work its way down. When I was in the Obama White House, there were some fierce debates, for strong patent, weak patent, no trade secret, yes trade secret, copyright gets in the way of the free flow of information and ideas versus we need to protect our creators. That existed 10 years ago when I was there, existed 10 years before that, and certainly exists now. But I don't see any wild swings on this front. I see a lot of angst, in how the Trump administration has been affecting some of its policies, which perhaps seeped its way through in your last panel that you mentioned, I think in London. But I don't see the IP system under attack. I do think we need to be careful for the indirect hits. Jamie mentioned kind of research. The U.S. has been a global leader in research, and research is international and collaborative by definition. So what happens if we have less international students coming in? What happens if we have less? That's going to impact innovation. Innovation will eventually trickle down into patents, and we might find ourselves in a strange position a decade from now looking at outputs then versus now. But I don't see the system itself being stressed, that somehow the U.S. would turn its back towards a strong and effective IP system.
If I could just add one thing, I think Danny's observations are very useful, and maybe the question could be flipped around a little bit. The external stressors on the U.S. system, I think, are quite unusual and unanticipated, in particular in China, because you have what is largely a state-dominated, oriented, planned IP system. And I think the U.S. had a lot of naivete about what the TRIPS agreement and what the WTO would do to non-market economies. We really could not have anticipated China's rise and the statist elements associated with it. You know, the preamble to the TRIPS agreement says that IP is a private property right. And who came up with that language? You can almost guess it, knowing Chinese history. It was the British colony of Hong Kong in the TRIPS negotiation. And they were probably thinking what the future might look like if a Maoist China joined the WTO. Because that's not the China of today. It wasn't even the China of 1980. But the reality is that IP can be a tool of autocratic regimes. And you don't have to reach too far back. Nazi Germany experimented a lot with intellectual property. North Korea has a patent clause in its constitution. The Confederate States launched their patent office very early in the Civil War. And the Soviet Union was one of the 10 largest patent offices for at least a half dozen years. Autocratic societies can use IP to their own advantage. Don't assume that they're going to evolve into democracies and free markets simply because they joined the TRIPS agreement and the WTO and they have some interesting experiments in free markets. And I think the US was singularly naive. In fact, I would consider one of the greatest trading lapses of the United States in the past 20 years was the failure to anticipate how China would change the global trading system and what it would do to intellectual property in particular. And I think we don't have the full explanation to either of those right now.
Doesn't that take us back to the point that I heard in London? You can have an IP system, but you can have an IP system that works, you know, ostensibly very well. Can you have a sustainable, long-lasting system that people buy into, and without confidence in the rule of law as well? That's saying that seems to me to be an absolutely fundamental point.
And I used to talk about this all the time in China. Can you have an IP system without rule of law? Can you have an IP system at a minimum without transparency? I think it's highly problematic. And unfortunately, I think some of this discussion, I hate to go back to this, it's a little bit of that horse around IP theft, focuses on the state role in intellectual property. And that was the biggest failure of the Phase 1 agreement on IP, which is that, no, it's about rights holders. It's about the lawyers sitting in this room being able to advise their clients, not the ability of the state, the United States, to deal with routine IP infringement matters. Yes, on a grand macro scale, we should engage our governments, but that's not the issue. It's whether you can protect your rights for your clients, big and small, in Chinese courts and administrative agencies.
I mean, to me, this is where the difference at a really high level between the US and Chinese market economies come into place, because in China, you can have kind of your patent rights on paper, whether or not they can be enforced, whether or not the rule of law is transparent and working. The funding, if it's coming from the state, it's going to come according to the state priorities. In the United States, with mostly private funding of research, if you don't have rule of law, you can't force your patents. No one's going to fund those patents, and we don't really have the same state backdrop to fill in the gaps for funding. So I think, you know, these two different systems, you have IP playing different roles, and it matters a lot more in the United States if we don't have kind of clear rule of law. And I think it's incredibly important for us. And I think it also goes back to kind of a more fundamental point, which is that, as Mark kind of explained, you can have IP under all these different regimes going back through history. But you know, something I think kind of is at the core of the US system is the idea that you have a patent, it's private right, and you kind of turn to the marketplace of ideas to see what's going to be successful. And that means a crazy idea that might never have been picked out in a more centralized regime has a shot if you have people who are willing to put some money behind it. And, you know, at least in theory, that means that you have the potential for more disruptive, more innovative ideas more frequently in this sort of system. And I kind of think we might be at a stage where we see a real life test of that between US and China potentially.
I would just add a little soundbite that we have to differentiate disruption with dysfunction. You can have disruption, doesn't mean that the entire IP system is dysfunctional.
Very fair point. We've spoken for half an hour and we haven't mentioned Europe. Is that because I haven't asked a question about Europe, or because Europe actually isn't that important?
But you're from this place called UK, which is no longer in Europe, right?
We're not anywhere anymore.
It was interesting, Europe filed a WTO case on standards essential patents, and the decision has not been published. I don't know if it will be. Apparently it was earlier this month. But one of the areas that was sustained of the European complaint was that, guess what? I don't know how many times I've said this, transparency, China needs to publish its cases. And that was kind of yeah, thank you. Because I really think that's extraordinarily important. And now they filed another case involving global rate setting. But the issue there is really that one of the issues is that the our U.S. Trade Representative Office in Geneva declined to support the European position, and in fact supported the Chinese position that it did not need to publish its internal policies regarding anti-suit injunctions. Really unusual, and I think really regrettable. I'm sure there were reasons they did that, but there were probably stronger reasons, in my view, at least not to do anything.
That would have been not under this administration. That would have been previous administration.
Previous administration.
That wasn't. That's interesting. So Europe. What do we make? What do we make of Europe? Is it just an observer here? It's going to have a really good call, really good for enforcement. If the US doesn't bring back injunctions, if the US brings back injunctions, then the UPC presumably dies a death.
Well, I wish it were that simple. No, I think Europe is incredibly important. The reason I didn't bring it up was definitely because you didn't ask a question about it yet. But I think, besides seeing how the UPC continues to turn out, Europe's incredibly important as a market, center of innovation. And I think most recently it's been really important in its propensity to put forward a lot of proposals. And I don't know that those are all necessarily good for the IP system. I would say a lot of the recent ones are problematic. I'm thinking in particular of the recently withdrawn EU proposal on standard essential patents. And I think it's interesting because there's the UPC on the one hand, and then there was this proposal on the other hand, which I think would have been very detrimental to rights holders and innovators, quite possibly very much depressed the amount of return they could expect on their innovations in a way that would have been harmful for them and for anyone, any innovators operating under a market economy. So I think they're an incredibly important part of the conversation because they do have the capacity to put forward a lot of regulations, and when they do, since they're such a big player, all the other jurisdictions really need to pay attention and figure out how they're still going to get a seat at the table, how they may or may not talk to their allies and get them to come to a different position. But they certainly can't be left out of the conversation.
Yes, I always think about Europe. We have a lot of bureaucrats in Europe that hate IP, but we end up with a very strong IP system. Whereas in the US, you have a lot of people that really like IP, but you have a much weaker IP system. It's kind of it's a strange one. We've got 10 minutes left. We've spoken about some quite fundamental things. I just wonder if there's any questions or comments from the floor. We've got quite a few. Yeah. Phil, you put your hand up first. So.
I don't need a microphone. I'll be loud. So I think what concerns me is and I think the comment was something like you could have disruption without complete, disaster, if you will, in the patent system. What I think concerns me is the retaliatory nature. I can't possibly have been the only person in the room. And I know, Mark, you brought up what happens if China just takes the IP, right? I could not have possibly been the only person that says one of the retaliatory things that may be on our plate here is that we just don't allow Chinese companies to get U.S. patents in. Am I the only person that's heard that? Is that a real thing? Where did it come from? Where is that? Is that a big concern? It seems like it's
I've read the same kind of rumors or heard the same rumors you have, like, well, one of the U.S.'s arrows could be that type of punitive measure. Look, I would discount some of that. I don't see any real likelihood that China is going to suddenly revoke, usurp, U.S. intellectual property. There are many lines that one would hope not to be crossed. I just don't even see that to be in play. I think there's some of this and rightful anxiety. This is a very anxious time that we're all living in, and that's the most polite way I can say it. But I don't see, like we saw with Russia, where Russia did, nationalize and take IP. I don't see that at play. It would be incredibly disruptive even for the Chinese economy to do that, and it would become radioactive as far as, having any type of export market if that's what they're going to be doing to their buyers of their products. So I don't see that, but I've heard the same rumors in the U.S. that the U.S. might be willing to do some of these things. I hope it's all venting, conjecture, and we won't really see it. I still remain positive that the IP system is not under attack, but it's more of the indirect, what if this happens, what if that happens? Then you have less investments. We're heavy in the copyright space. If you have tariffs on phones and on gaming consoles, less are sold, which means less games are downloaded, which means less investments go into content, which means that's I think where the impact potentially could be for IP intensive industries, rather than the regime itself being under attack.
Yeah, I would just put a few footnotes on Danny's observations, because I think that politically China is probably not inclined to do that. It's not like they don't have the authority to do that. I think because they want to show they have a fair IP system for the benefit of companies investing and trading in China, and that they've been under such criticism for so many decades, I don't think they're inclined. It's possible, but I don't think they're inclined. That being said, about a month or so ago, the State Council issued a regulation on addressing misuse of IP by foreign companies and governments, and they talked about not cooperating with foreign courts in particular cases, not providing evidence, not enforcing judgments, launching antitrust investigations and all that. There's ways to make IP an actionable topic without necessarily seizing it. And I think we've seen with the launch of, I think, an antitrust case against Google right around the time the tariffs were announced, and there's lots of other ways they can do that using antitrust and other vehicles at their command. I get a lot of inquiries from the Hill frequently on proposed legislation. I know it was discussed in the context of IPRs, that since that's a discretionary approval by the director, whether the director should now stop approving IPRs involving Chinese companies, maybe without announcing it. It would just happen to occur, I guess, because otherwise you do start running into this horrible sequence of events. You're biased against me, I'll be biased against you, and the whole system starts eroding. I think smaller economies, though, would be more inclined to play with it, as Antigua did in the WTO case, where they were authorized to seize US IP rights.
There's a question here.
Yeah, I wanted to situate this within the broader discussion that's going on in the business world and kind of geopolitical policy space, where a lot of people are of the view that in the whole wireless-enabled, chip-enabled, dual-use tech ecosystem, that basically within a decade, there's going to be some type of soft decoupling where you've got the China market and you've got everything else as a combination both of export controls on our side, and then you've got the made in China dual circulation theory going on the China side. So are we going to have two IP systems? We're going to have kind of IP in China, mostly just for China-based firms, protected market, and then the rest of the world going to kind of keep doing business as usual.
Yeah, that's one possible outcome. I think one obvious result of that is scalability is now not about reaching 3 billion or 5 billion customers, but it's something much smaller as the US plus Europe, Japan, Korea, Australia, whatever, and China would probably have, a whole bunch of the rest of the world. It remains to be seen. It's a possible scenario, but the reality is China's producing, 90% of the cell phones? We're talking about the other 10% perhaps. So China has already grabbed so much of the global value chains in a lot of these products.
It's the case, for example, with SEPs, that more and more SEPs are now owned by Chinese companies, and more and more Chinese companies becoming SEP licensors. I guess there's an argument that actually we want the global system to continue because we want the ability to access this Chinese technology. And if we can do it, and I'll give a shout out to the company I work for now, patent pools like Sisvel, which are not based in China, and are not run by Chinese people. You've got us as intermediaries. That's actually a more effective way of distributing the IP than might otherwise be the case.
Joff, 2 minutes.
2 minutes, so there's lots more questions. Oh, you've asked 2 questions already, Peter.
Yeah, I actually wanted to go back to Russia. So I remember back in March of 2022, when the Russian government actually announced this risk of compulsory licenses of IP or IP owners from certain countries that were not favored. And it seemed quite alarming at the time, and there were some articles about it. And I don't recall really ever hearing any follow-up. I did some research. I was asking around, how did that actually play out? We even talked to some of our outside counsel at INTA last year, and they seem to have no idea what we were talking about. So I'm curious, like, what is the latest on that? Has it just been an empty threat?
I don't know if someone has any hands-on information on Russia on that. I don't know. I do know what happened with Germany in World War I, where the assets were taken over by the U.S. government, particularly on aspirin and some other from Bayer and other companies. And they were managed by a custodian for the duration of the war and frankly for some time after.
Go on, Peter, ask your question.
California, since we're in California, California's governor today announced they are now the 4th largest economy in the world, surpassing Japan. Now it's just US, China, Germany, California. So maybe we'll have the delete IP economy of California. We can have this versus the world in 2 systems.
Okay. Question here? Yes.
So we've kind of discussed state-mediated IP regimes, but there's some also private sector frameworks in place like the LOT network. And I know a lot of Chinese companies are part of LOT, including Tencent. And I was just curious, does LOT still make sense in an environment where Chinese companies effectively can't do business in the US? Like, what's the value of having LOT in such an environment? I guess this is a question for Danny because Tencent is
It was not working, but I mean, Chinese companies can and do business in the United States. I know the political environment makes it seem like it's impossible, but you know, we have 4,000 employees in the U.S. We contribute billions to the local economy. We partner with the who's who of the U.S. tech and entertainment community. Yes, the rhetoric is making it exceedingly squirmy. It's a very technical term, but you know, there hasn't been that type of decoupling, to use that phrase here. Now, should there be deterioration? Yes, it will be continually difficult. You see some of the punitive measures that are being discussed of like, well, we're publicly traded in Hong Kong, so we don't have kind of New York type issues, but you know, delistings, can't benefit from capital gains, outbound investments. If you start enacting all of that, I think you will see that type of decoupling of physical and digital markets, and that wouldn't bode well for, I think most companies, wouldn't bode well for international stability, harmonization. We'd be going in 2 different directions. So I do hope that, you know, US and China, as well as other countries, can figure it out, you know, over the next few months and years, but it's the thing to watch, right? It's going to be the question of our lifetime.
And on that bombshell, Mark, Jamie, Danny, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.